Watergate scandal and the Saturday Night Massacre, conflict within the White House leading up to the compromise of Nixon's resignation, by Jessica Robinson, Senior Vision Individual Documentary. 1973 is a troublesome year for America. In the midst of the Cold War, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, has a lot on his plate. January 8, 1973, begins the first trial into what Americans know today as the Watergate scandal. The special prosecutor for this case, Archibald Cox, will soon become Nixon's next enemy. The eventual firing of Cox will be known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The conflict that arose within the Saturday Night Massacre led the Watergate scandal to escalate and eventually to the compromise of Nixon's resignation. The Watergate scandal is a series of events best known for terminating President Richard Nixon's career. It all began on June 17, 1972, when a security guard by the name of Frank Wills finds evidence of a break-in at the Democratic offices in the Watergate building. Many doorknobs are covered in masking tape to keep them from closing. Wills recognizes that something is wrong and calls the police. It is here that 5 men are arrested for illegal wiretapping. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opens an investigation into this incident. Their examination leads them to indict 7 men. 2 of these men are G. Gordon Liddy, a financial member for the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, or otherwise known as CREEP, and James W. McCord Jr., the CRP security consultant. The indictment of these men give reason that the burglary could be part of Nixon's re-election campaign. Another man indicted, E. Howard Hunt Jr., former White House security consultant, also connects the burglary to the White House. Many newspapers begin to report about the break-in. Most notable, the Washington Post.
When we heard about the break-in into the Watergate Hotel, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. But as time went on, and as these reporters got involved in it, came to find out that our president and a lot of men in the government were involved in this and had an active role in it. And that was a surprise to us all. I mean, that actually hit the papers and was headlines for quite a while. And for months, there was just headline after headline, of individuals in his cabinet that were being accused of these wrongdoings.
They are the first people to connect Nixon to the burglary. Nixon later says on a broadcast,
I repeatedly asked those conducting the investigation whether there was any reason to believe that members of my administration were in any way involved. I received repeated assurances that there were not.
Nixon also explains that he, quote,
ordered that anyone who refused to cooperate in telling the truth would be asked to resign from government service.
In November of 1972, the presidential election is administered. Richard Nixon can serve his second term in office, or Democratic nominee George McGovern could have a chance at presidency. However, Nixon wins the election by over 60% of the popular votes and 49 out of 50 states' electoral votes. Nixon is set to be president for another 4 years. But with all the love and votes for Nixon, people continue to question his involvement with the Watergate affair. A couple months later, the Senate votes to create the Senate Watergate Committee. This committee, ran by Sam Erving, is responsible for investigating campaign abuses of power in the 1972 presidential election. Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, calls a man by the name of Archibald Cox to see if he will take the job of the special Watergate prosecutor. He accepts the offer, and in May of 1973, the Senate Judiciary Committee makes former Texas Attorney Archibald Cox special prosecutor in the investigation. Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, later writes that the White House, quote, did not need a special prosecutor. I'm confident the individuals we had in office possessed the demeanor and intelligence necessary to see the Watergate investigation down to its inevitable conclusion. 2 months later, Deputy Assistant Alexander Butterfield testifies to the Senate committee about the presence of the White House taping system.
He would tape conversations in the White House, and actually it was these tapes that brought him down.
The White House confirms this statement and people begin to take sides. Robert Bork writes that, quote, with this revelation, the need for Nixon to augment his personal legal team became obvious. Nixon, at this point, has almost everyone against him. On July 23, 1973, the Senate committee and Archibald Cox request 9 of the White House tapes from Nixon. They order that he bring them to court. 2 days later, Nixon refuses because of executive privilege, and the committee files a lawsuit for failure to comply. On October 19th, Nixon has Elliot Richardson offer the Stennis Compromise to Cox. The compromise has Mississippi Senator John Stennis review the recordings on the tapes and summarize them. Then Cox will receive the summaries. It was October 20th, 1973, when Cox declines the offer and does not accept the Stennis Compromise. Nixon retaliates and orders Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson prefers to resign from his office than to take out his order, so he does. After Richardson's resignation, Nixon asked the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, to discharge Cox from office. He too refuses and resigns with Richardson. With these events, Robert Bork is now acting Attorney General. Bork is also ordered by Nixon to fire Cox, and he does. This conflict of October 20th, 1973 is known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Since the man most involved with the Watergate investigation is gone, Nixon turns the investigation to the Justice Department. But it is only 3 days after the massacre that Nixon agrees to give up the tapes. On the 1st of November, the Justice Department appoints Leon Jaworski as the new Watergate Special Prosecutor. The department distances themselves from President Nixon and wants people to realize that they are not, quote, a pawn of the president, as some people called them. One tape in particular that took a while to be released has an 18.5-minute gap in between it. The White House is hesitant to release it because people would think Nixon sabotaged it. The public's distrust and hatred only grew from here. The White House Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig, stated that the gap could have been caused by Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, when she accidentally pressed record while on the phone. However, Woods testifies that she could not have been the reason for the entire gap in the recording. She says that she may have erased 5 minutes at the most. The majority of investigators never believe Haig's testimony. On April 29, 1974, Nixon gives a speech saying that the tapes are edited to protect government confidentiality, but it only makes things worse. The House Judiciary Committee is outraged that the tapes are edited to the point that any relation to Watergate is non-existent. Finally, in July of 1974, the Supreme Court demands the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, to release the unedited recordings. The tapes prove what everyone thought. Nixon knew of the attempts of covering up the break-in at the Watergate building since March of 1973. They reveal that Nixon paid many people to hide his misconduct. He also had all of his close staff members resign and not connect his name to any Watergate relations. By now, everyone, even his strong supporters, are hoping for his impeachment. It is time for Nixon and his colleagues to compromise with America. August 8, 1974 is an important day in history. Nixon resigns. In his last public address as president, he states that he, quote, shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. By taking this action, I hope that I will have hastened the start of that process of healing, which is so desperately needed for America. The Saturday Night Massacre and Nixon's resignation will cause emotions all throughout America. A Duquesne University law professor, Ken Gormley, writes that, quote, the Saturday Night Massacre was a single event in his long and controversial political life, from which Richard M. Nixon, president of the most powerful nation in the world, would never recover, in his 1997 Archibald Cox biography. Since the scandal, the government has enforced many laws to protect the public's trust. The Freedom of Information Act makes any citizen able to access declassified government information. Campaign laws have also been put into place to prevent overspending and unfair campaigns. Subsequent to Nixon's death in 1994, the Richard Nixon Foundation has been established for people to learn more about Watergate and Nixon's life. In addition, all the controversial tapes can now be accessible to anyone at nixontapes.org or at the Richard Nixon Foundation website. As Nixon once said, the finest steel has to go through the hottest fire.